Good morning to one and all present here. This morning is special to all of us online as we are the part of the webinar on post-colonial studies organized by the Department of English. It gives me immense pleasure to introduce the resource person, Dr. Mehranisha Pathan. Dr. Mehranisha Pathan is presently working as an Associate Professor, Department of English at Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar Marathwada University, Aurangabad, Maharashtra, India. She has more than 17 years of teaching and research experience. She has published near about 37 research papers in national and international journals. She has participated in near about 97 national and international conference, seminars, workshops, symposium, and presented research paper. She is appointed as an external examiner by various universities. As a research person, she has delivered lectures at the Refresh Orientation, short-term course, and pre-PhD courseworks. She has designed various courses for the postgraduate and MPhil course. She is working on various national and international journals as an editorial board member and the member of review committee. She has coordinated various activities for postgraduate, MPhil, and PhD students. She was the coordinator for the Micro Scholarship Language Access Program organized by USEFI USA. She has completed minor, major research project sponsored by UGC, ICSSR, New Delhi. Currently, she has completed a sponsored research project on the digital feminism, a study in Sanskrit, English, and Urdu literature, and has coined a new term called Indian digital feminism. 18 students are awarded MPhil degree and 3 with PhD degree under her supervision. Her area of interest are postcolonial studies, resistance discourse, feminist discourse, English language teaching, critical theory, discourse studies, and so on. She has completed her research under the supervision of Dr. A.G. Khan, entitled Resistance Discourse, a study in the fiction of Farid Karodia Meher Pistonje and Kaveri Nambazin. Now, I welcome a resource person to share her valuable thoughts. Welcome, ma'am.
Thank you. Am I audible? Yes. Hello.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Am I audible?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes. The organizers of the 3-day international virtual conference on post-colonial studies, organized by the Research Department of English, NI Venkatani College, Kanyakumari, Tamil Nadu, India, in collaboration with Cape Comorin Trust, India, Lavender Literary Club, India, International Tamils Development Trust, and Cape Comorin Publisher, India. At the very outset, I am immensely pleased to be invited by the organizers to make my presentation as a keynote address to this 3-day international virtual conference. Let me share my screen. Let me begin with the keynote address, starting with the concept of colonialism. So we move on to actually earlier when I had a word with Regan Silvest, he requested me rather to go with colonial and post-colonial literature. And that's how I would be looking at it from a critical perspective. So moving on to colonialism. According to Oxford English Dictionary, the word colony is derived from a Latin word colonus, which is used for a farmer, a cultivator, a planter, or a settler in new country. Colonia has the census of a farm, a landed estate, a settlement. It was especially used for a public settlement of Roman citizens in a hostile or newly conquered country where they retained their Roman citizenship, received land, and acted as garrison, being mostly veteran soldiers who had served their time. Hence, it was applied to place so occupied or a town which was raised to the same rank and privileges. So among the 9 Roman colonies in Britain were London, Bath, Chester, and Lincoln. And I have used over here, according to Ania Lomba, what she has mentioned related to the term colonia or the term colony. So the term colony comes from the Roman colonia, which meant farm or settlement and referred to Romans who settled in other lands, but still it continued their citizenship. Moving on to the history of colonialism, it starts with the Romans in England. The historical phenomena of colonization is one that stretches around the globe and across time, including separate peoples such as the Hittites, the Incas, and the British. So by the 1920s and 30s, the Britishers, they were able to colonize 1/3 part of the world's population. And wherever they went with their language, that is English, their religion, Christianity, and culture, that was the British culture, and especially literature, which is British literature. And we know that it's a glorifying literature. So 1/3 part of the world's population was able to read, write, speak, or listen the English language. Now, moving on to colonialism. So we do have land-based empires and the overseas empires. So the land-based empires, they include the Mughal Empire, stretching from the Western Pacific to Eastern Europe, the Empire of Alexander the Great, the Umayyad, the Caliphate, the Persian Empire, the Roman Empire, and the Byzantine Empire. So the overseas empires, they included Ottoman Empire, which was created across the Mediterranean and North Africa to Southeastern Europe and existed during the time of European colonization. So we look at, you can see on the screen, European colonization. It can be broadly divided into 2 large waves, like the age of exploration and new imperialism. We do have superpowers like the Spanish, the British, the Portuguese, the French, and others. So the age of exploration, the beginning of Columbian exchange, and the beginning of the second part of the 19th century, it started with new imperialistic period. So European colonialism began in 15th century with Portuguese conquest of Ceuta. Colonialism was led by Portuguese and Spanish exploration of America, along with the coast of Africa, the Middle East, India, and the East Asia. So the later half of 16th century witnessed the expansion of the state throughout our land. So it was not until the 17th century that Britain, France, and the Netherlands successfully established overseas empires in direct competition with Spain and Portugal and with each other. It was only in the 19th century the British grew up to become the largest in the world. And as it was been said, the sun never sets on the empire. Now we move on to the types of colonies. So there are various types of colonies such as the settler, dependency, plantation, and trading post. An example of settler colony, it consists of 13 states of United States of America, with Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, along with Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, Argentina, and so with policies in Siberia that arouse from immigration of people from a metropolis or other country. In dependencies, the colonizers did not arrive as a part of mass immigration, but as administrators over existing sizable native populations, having control by use of threat or force. And examples of dependencies are the British Raj, Egypt, the Dutch, the East Indies, Japanese colonial empire, the Medzos of America, French Algeria, and Southern Rhodesia. So white colonizers, they imported black slaves, Saint Domingo and Jamaica trading posts engage in trade rather than colonization. And examples of these are Macau, Malacca, Decimona, and Singapore. Now we move on to colonialism and imperialism. Dennis Jude, he argues in his book entitled as Empire, the British Imperial Experience from 1765 to the present. And this is what has been mentioned. Colonialism was first and foremost part of commercial venture of the Western nations that developed from the late 17th century and early 18th century. So colonialism was a lucrative commercial operation, bringing wealth and riches to the Western nations through the economic exploitations of others. So colonialism and capitalism share a mutually supportive relationship with each other. So it was been, as it is being said, that the golden bird from India has been taken away by the Britishers or the whites. So they consider themselves to be superior in race as a duty towards God to obey the orders of the king or the queen and to generate resources for their mother country. So if you look at this concept, so colonialism is sometimes used interchangeably with imperialism, as Peter Childs and Patrick Williams remark. I'm quoting from them. Imperialism is an ideological concept which upholds the legitimacy of economic and military control of one nation by another. So colonialism, however, is only one form of practice which results from the ideology of imperialism and specifically concerns the settlement of one group of people in new location. So imperialism is not strictly concerned with the issue of settlement. It does not demand the settlement of different places in order to work, unquote. So moving on to next slide. Here you can see on the slide colonialism and imperialism as an ideology of imperialism. It's an ideological concept. Examples like military control and economic. Moving ahead with colonialism. So Elik Bohemer defines colonialism in her book called Colonial and Postcolonial Literature, Migrant Metaphors. And this is what has been mentioned as the settlement of a territory, the exploitation or development of resources, and the attempt to govern the indigenous inhabitants of occupied lands. I would be once again coming back to the indigenous people further in my presentation, who are they or who they are. Now moving on to colonialism, as I mentioned, duty towards God, queen or king, resources for the mother country, and colonized people. They are at the periphery, the destruction of their language, literature, religion, culture, and so on, and the kind of binary that has been created, like the rest versus the east versus the west versus the rest, and how they are being considered to be inferior or slaves. So the relationship of colonialism is based on the binary opposition. Now moving on to this binary opposition, as I mentioned, like the colonizer, colonized, center, periphery, Orient and the Occidents and the Orients, the West and the rest. So the relationship of colonialism is based on binary opposition: colonizer, colonized, center, periphery, Orient, and Occident. And this relationship of colonizer, colonized is based on the binary oppositions of white, black, masculine, feminine, beautiful, ugly, and so on and so forth, wherein the colonizers are seen as superior and the colonized as the inferior. So because of their supremacy, the Europeans also spread their religion to the underdeveloped, or what is being called as the backward nations. Now, we talk about this kind of British, they thought that it would be better for the human race if they colonize it. Their colonization was considered a better duty towards God, queen, and country. So colonialism created a traumatic and complex relationship between the natives and the colonizers. Now we move on to, there was an economic imbalance in this system. So Ngugi wa Thiong'o says that decolonization is a process and it has to be completed. So postmodernism is a term that includes all kinds of isms, feminisms. I'm talking about all the waves of feminism, everything that has been included in discourses, various discourses, theories, different theories, and one of the offshoots of postmodernism can be seen as the colonial and post-colonial literatures. Now, moving on to the development of the post-colonial mode of discourse as a direct derivative of postmodernist theories of knowledge and culture, it creates a historical crisis for the study of decolonization. Now, what is being needed? So there was a need to liberate the discourse from hegemonic connotations and neo-colonialist entanglements of such terms as Commonwealth literature, new literature, and new literatures in English or third world literature. A.M. Césaire, in his book called Discourse on Colonialism, claims that colonialism not only exploits but also dehumanizes and objectifies the colonial subject, just as it degrades the colonizers themselves. So these were the terms that were being used. So moving on to colonialism, it's like an aloe vera plant that serves as medicinal plant as well as produces thorns. Colonialism has pessimistic as well as optimistic effects on indigenous people, land, and resources. Diderot was one of the most famous critics of European colonization. In his historic Dex Index, he challenged that the primitive people had benefited from European civilization and argued that the European colonialists were uncivilized, stating that, I'm quote, the European traders have proved themselves dangerous as guests, unquote. So as we all are aware of the East India Company, so the Britishers came to India in disguise of traders and slowly and gradually colonized different princely states, a large part including Pakistan, Afghanistan, Bangladesh to some extent. Now we move on to the world theories, like the first world, the second world, the third world. So the colonial world was divided into three world theories, the first, second, and the third world, where you can see on the slide, the first world countries are Britain, France, Germany, Portugal, second world countries like America, Australia, Canada, and so on and so forth. So moving to the three world theories, binaries such as colonizer, colonized, first world, third world, and West and the rest of the world came into existence, representing the ideological view of Eurocentric critics who believed in such categorization of the world. I quote from Ejaz Ahmed in his book, In Theory, Classes, Nations, and Literatures, the social collapse. I'm quoting from Ejaz Ahmed. The social collapse of common countries has, of course, complicated this matter of three world theory a great deal, and it is likely that category itself may now be abandoned altogether, more out of confusion than anything else, to be replaced simply with eclectic play, thus refurbishing the already hegemonic academic philosophies of difference. Now, moving on to the three world theories, as I mentioned, based on colonial countries and once colonized countries, it has no relevance in the present times where the world has emerged into global village. And in my later part of my presentation, I would be coming on to the global pandemic. So critics of economic and political advantages accruing to developed nations via globalized capitalism have referred to colonized countries as neo-colonialists and see them as a continuation of the domination and exploitation by the colonizers, merely utilizing different means. So they point to such former colonies such as United States of America, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Hong Kong, Singapore, and these are some of the examples of post-colonial success. So moving on to post-colonialism, post-colonial, which is being hyphenated and which is without hyphenated. So the first one is without hyphenated. The post-colonial speaks about colonial discourse, or it is also considered a theory after colonialism. Here with hyphenated, it talks about the material effects, historical condition of colonialism, and aftermaths of colonialism. So post-colonial theory, as we all know, it's a theories in philosophy, film, political sciences, literature that deals with cultural legacy of colonial rule. It deals with literature that has been produced in countries that were colonies of other countries, especially the European colonial past, as I mentioned already, Britain, France, and Spain, and also includes countries still in colonial arrangements. So Edward Said book, Orientalism, it is considered to be the source book. Stephen Silman is one of the intellectual founding figures of postcolonialism. He has compared postcolonialism to a suitcase blown open on the baggage belt. So the term has generated much debate among scholars, and this makes it difficult to fix its exact meaning. So the term post-colonial is a particular historical period or epoch, like those suggested by phrases such as after colonialism, after independence, or after the end of empire. So the prefix post continues to be a source of vigorous debate among critics. In simple words, post means after. Post-colonialism stresses the articulations between and across politically defined historical periods of pre-colonialism, colonialism, and post-colonialism. So moving further, post-colonialism, here I have taken up the 3 to 4 names like Edward Said, Homi Bhabha, Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak, and Bill Ashcroft, Granite Griffin, and Helen Tiffin's texts that have been considered to be the pioneers of that. So the study of controlling power of representation in colonized societies had begun in the late 1970s with the texts such as Said Orientalism, and it has led to development of colonialist discourse theory in works of critics such as Bhabha and Spivak. So Spivak used the term post-colonial for the first time in her collection of interviews and recollections, The Post-Colonial Critic, that was published in 1990. So the term was a site of disciplinary and interpretative contention almost from the beginning, especially given the implications involved in signifying the hyphen or its absence. So we move on to post-colonialism, as I have already mentioned. So theorists like Edward Said, Homi Bhabha, Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak, they have made great contributions to the development of colonial and post-colonial theory. Said was influenced by Michel Foucault. Homi Bhabha, to a great extent, was being influenced by Jacques Lacan and Louis Althusser, and Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak by Jacques Derrida. Ejaz Ahmed asserts that when the term colonialism can be pushed back to the Incas and forward to the Indonesian occupation of East Timor, then it becomes a trans-historical thing, always present and always in the process of dissolution in one part of the world or another. So according to Bhabha, the word post in post-colonialism, postmodernism, or post-feminism, it represents, I'm quoting from Homi Bhabha, the beyond is neither a new horizon nor a leaving behind of past. Beginnings and endings may be sustaining myths of middle years, but in the fin de siècle, we can find ourselves in the moment of trends where space and time cross to produce complex figures of difference and identity, past and present, inside and outside, inclusions and exclusions. For there is a sense of disorientation, a disturbance or direction in the beyond, and exploratory restless movement caught so well in French retention of the words étule, here and there, all sides, forte, hither and thither, back and forth, unquote. So this was from Homi Bhabha. I have taken up this particular poem from David Punter's book, and the title of that book is Post-Colonial Imagings, Fictions in New World Order. So after thousands of years, like the same beaten up question, the same beaten up man is still being asked, who are you? Where do you live? What's your name? The prisoner who patrols a motionless octagonal cell holds their grenades captive in the same time. Everywhere outside a forest of iron bars has spread its stranglehold like a magnet's invisible lines of force. And this is solid proof of success of a massive built up of arms that as soon as we have gun in our hand, enemy heads begin to appear all around us. So moving ahead, we do have this kind of a sender and receiver. So the colonizer, they were at the center, and the texts that were being produced, they were being received at the end of, by the colonized or those who were at the periphery. So this was actually, I was inspired as I have been teaching for decades now, English language teaching. So the sender and the receiver, when we talk about the communication, so we from that a bit I got inspired, and I could have this kind of a relationship established with the colonizer and the colonized. So the colonizers used to consider their literary text to be the best and insisted on rest of the world, basically the colonized countries, reading them. Here, the sender in the colonial period or during colonization was the British or the white colonizers, as they represented the center. So the colonized people, they serve the purpose of the receiver, receiving the text and considering it to be the best. Hence, the literature, we know it's a glorifying literature, the great writers and so on and so forth. Hence, the relationship of sender and receiver was successful until the colonized countries achieved independence or understood its significance. So it is said that post-colonial theory is based on subversion and resistance. I would be coming on to resistance in the later part of my presentation. So these once colonized countries, after gaining their independence or realizing its need, started writing back to the empire to achieve an identity or re-identify themselves. So the sender took the position of receiver, and the receiver took the position of the sender. The colonized took that of the sender, that is the colonizer. So this writing back paradigm took place during colonialism and continues in the post-colonial period. So here you can see after colonialism, during post-colonial period, we do have this kind of a writing back paradigm. So using the work of Fanon and Said and later Bhabha and Spivak, these texts were primarily concerned with writing back to the center, actively engaging in the process of questioning and transvesting colonial discourses in their works. I have also taken up the examples from Bill Ashcroft, Graneth Griffin, Helen Tiffin, attempted albeit problematically to bring the Oriental insights to bear on readings of post-colonial texts. Recently, the treatise of Bhabha and Spivak has become the focus of much commentary and debate in post-colonialism. Collectively, this has helped to create post-colonial theory as a separate discipline, sometimes at the expense of criticism of post-colonial literature. Now we move on to the readers of present-day experience. Empire textually, though the medium of 19th and 20th century novels and periodicals, travel writing and scraps of doggerel, empire was itself, at least in part, a textual exercise. So here we have humanism, then we have modernism, and we talk about postmodernism. We talk about imperialism, colonialism, and post-colonialism. Now I would be moving on. Bill Ashcroft, Graneth Griffin, Helen Tiffin's definition, that has been how they defined or how they look at the post-colonial literature. So writing by those countries, this has been given in the Empire Writes Back. And you can see on the screen, writing by those people formerly colonized by Britain, though much of what it deals with is of interest and relevance to countries colonized by other European powers such as France, Portugal, and Spain, the semantic basis of the term post-colonial might seem to suggest a concern only with the national culture after the departure of imperial power. So it has occasionally been employed in some earlier work in the area to distinguish between the periods before and after independence. We also have scholars like Tiffin, Bridgen, and Hume, those who have implicitly or explicitly follow the definition of post-colonialism as given in the Empire Writes Back, without further problematizing its implication. The African writer Ngugi wa Thiong'o in Post-Colonial Politics and Culture, 1993, points to continuities of colonial structures in post-colonial Kenya, especially in cultural politics such as language as instructions in schools and universities. He argues that resistance to undemocratic structures as well as its repression use similar strategies as under colonialism. So Ngugi wa Thiong'o's post-colonialism implicitly means after colonialism. Nyi Osundra's critic in How Post-Colonial is African Literature, 1994, it also engages more directly with post-colonial theory as discourse. Now moving on to, again, I have been inspired, as I mentioned, that I have been teaching for a decade English language teaching. So here we do have English, which has been spoken as the first language. So countries like Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and other countries where English is being spoken as the first language. So these Though these colonized countries, they produce post-colonial literatures, these nations, they can be distinguished from each other on the basis of their first language being English, and the group of nations where English is a foreign language to them. So the literature produced by the second group of nations, they utilized in the tension between two or more language systems and cultures. This has been also pointed out by A. Srivastav in Commonwealth Review of 1989, and with the name, again, Commonwealth Literature. I am using here Michael Bakhtin's theory of dialogism. Ron Blabler considers the relation of post-colonial writing to the traditional literary canon. Bakhtin's idea is that every society is fundamentally heteroglot. That is, they are populated by a plurality of languages in a dialogue struggle with each other. In some societies, certain languages tend to attain dominance over others and thus approach monoglossia. So the literary canon also aims at monoglossia by excluding, marginalizing, or appropriating certain fields of discourse through decontextualization and the development of a passive monolithic reading practice. So heteroglossic backgrounds of the present day readers, for instance, their familiarity with other media, such as television or comics, challenges the canon's monoglossic claims. So we move on to another slide. Here I have talked about Terry Galton, how he talks about or how he looks at culture. So culture is a child of a one parent family and so on and so forth. I am not going to get into the details of that. Let me move on to the term discourse. So the term discourse has become common in various fields as critical theory, sociology, linguistic, philosophy, and social psychology. So the term was used for common knowledge. It is also used widely in analyzing literary and non-literary text, and it is also often employed to signal a certain theoretical sophistications in the ways that are vague and sometimes obfuscatory. So it has widest range of possible significations of any term in literary and cultural theory, and in theoretical text, it is the term that is least defined. So we move on to the term discourse as critical theories, sociology, psychology, linguistics, and so on and so forth. And I move on to one of the definitions. I'm not going to get much into details of discourse also. So I'm looking at the Collins Concise English Dictionary, 1998. It defined the word discourse as verbal communication, talk, conversation, a formal treatment of a subject in speech or writing, a unit of text used by linguists for analysis of linguistic phenomena that range over more than sentence. To discourse means the ability to reason. To discourse means an open to speak or to write about formally or to give forth. 14th century for medieval Latin discourses, arguments from Latin are running to and fro from discrete. So I move on to another slide based on discourse. So discourse, to read, to speak, to discuss a text, a verbal expression, to reason. So taking the above definitions, so discourse can be defined as an act of speaking or writing, a talk or conversation, a formal treatment of subject in speech or writing, or a unit of text used by linguists for analysis, the ability to reason and to formally speak and write on. So it may also refer to conversation of a formal nature and the expression of ideas through speech and writing. So we do have Colin Roberts' Concise French Dictionary, 1990, defined a discourse as a speech or discourse, all fine talk, or again, if you look at the term discourse, to hold forth upon. So the meaning of discourse changes from one academic discipline to another. For instance, when linguists, they talk about discourse of advertising, they are referring to something quite different to the socio-psychologist who talks of a discourse of racism. So we do have different definitions that are being given over here for discourse analysis. Basically, I took it from David Crystal, attempt to pinpoint the meaning of discourse within linguistics by contrasting its use to the term text. So he says, or he argues, or he mentions over here, discourse analysis focuses on the structure of the naturally occurring spoken language as found in such discourses as conversation, interviews, commentaries, and speech. Text analysis focuses on the structure of written language as found in such texts as essays, notice, road signs and chapters, but this distinction is not clear cut, and there have been many other uses of these labels. So the particular discourse and text can be used in much broader sense to include all language units with a definable communicative function, whether spoken or written. So some scholars, they talk about spoken or written discourse, other they talk about spoken or written text. So we do have oppositional terms over here, again moving on to Michel Foucault's view of the role of discourse is even wider when he talks about, here I mentioned about the oppositional term text, sentence, and ideology, and then I will be moving on to this particular definition, or looking how Michel Foucault looks at this. The view, how he views the role of discourse is even wider and more pervasive. He argues that discourse is crucial feature of modernity itself. So discourses are a group of statements which have some institutionalized force, as they have a strong influence on the way that individuals act and think. So Foucault's study begins with immense talk of dismantling the theme of knowledge as an expression of ideas. So Foucault's work has been crucial to the development of range of different theories which have been broadly grouped under the term discourse theory. And it is for this reason that it stands as a primary work in this field. So Foucault challenges many of the preconceived notions about different subjects, such as sexuality, madness, discipline, subjectivity, and so on and so forth. So moving on to discourse. Here I am looking at discourse as literary text, and the non-literary text as also discourse. So the study of discourse does not differentiate between literary and non-literary texts, though discourse theorists are keenly aware of the institutionalized differences that exist between the two sets of text. History texts are privileged in their relation to truth, while autobiographical writings are supposed to be authentic in their relation to the authorial voice. And however, the literary texts have a complex relation to both truth and value, providing the truth about human society and human condition, and doing so within functional and therefore untrue form. So here literary text based on truth, value, and fictional as untrue form of that. So literary criticism and literary history in the 18th and 19th century constituted the person of the author and the figure of oeuvre, using, modifying, and displacing the procedures of religious exegesis, biblical criticism, hagiography, historical and legendary lives, autobiography, or memoirs. I have quoted it from Foucault himself, how he states. So Foucault's work has helped a number of theorists consider the way that English literature as a discipline works. Moving on to ideology. So Michel Foucault has also mentioned about the notion of ideology appears to me to be difficult to use for three reasons. This is what he has mentioned. The first is whether one wants it to be or not. It is always in virtual opposition, something like the truth. The second inconvenience is that it refers necessarily. Thirdly, ideology is in secondary position in relation to something which must function as infrastructure or economic or mental determinant. So here I would be moving on to the post-colonial discourse. That's why I have to refer to the emergence of discourse and how it originates. So we look at post-colonial discourse based on language, truth, and power. So Foucault's and Said's sense of post-colonial discourse, it invokes certain ways of thinking about language, truth, and power, about the interrelationships between them. So power is that which determines and verifies truth. Truth is never outside power, and the production of truth is a function of it. So power is invested in language because it provides the terms in which truth itself is constituted. So here I have mentioned about that. Let me also, because I've been talking about discourse, so let me a bit mention about the minority discourse. So moving on to Jan Muhammad and David Lloyd, it was an essay titled as Introduction Towards a Theory of Minority Discourse, 1987. Focus on minority discourse as a strategy of survival, identity preservation, and political critique. So they asked for a coalition of minorities that, without obliterating cultural difference, recognizes their common political subject, position, and struggle for re-empowerment. So as minority individuals are always treated and forced to experience themselves generically, they often transform this negative position into a positive one through conscious collective literary articulations. So minority intellectuals remain doubly alienated due to their marginalization within hegemonic institutions on the one hand, and other relatively privileged positions compared to non-intellectual minority individuals on the other. So they suggest that this alienation must be overcome by a combination of theoretical and practice struggle. For instance, a critique of tradition universalist, Eurocentric humanism and its disciplinary division. Now we move on to the actual term, that is resistance, because it is considered that post-colonial literature is nothing but it is the literature of representation and resistance. So the concept of resistance, it was put forward by Sylvain Kudzo and Barbara Harlow in Resistance and Caribbean Literature and Resistance Literature respectively. So resistance is again based on political power itself inscribes its resistances, literary text as structure of intentionality. So here I would be just mentioning one or two lines from Barbara Harlow and Sylvain Kudzo in the text that was Resistance and Caribbean Literature and Resistance Literature, what they have tried to look at resistance as. So an act or a set of acts that is designed to rid a people of its oppressors, and it so thoroughly infuses the experience of living under oppression that it becomes an almost autonomous aesthetic principle. So literary resistance under these conditions can be seen as a form of contractual understanding between text and reader, one which is embedded in an experimental dimension and buttressed as a political or cultural aesthetic at work in culture. So resistance literature in this definition can thus be seen as that category of literary writing which emerges as an integral part of an organized struggle or resistance or national liberation, unquote. So from the above definition, these are the things that we can come on to, like I would be moving on to these two or three problems. The first problem arises with political concern. The center-periphery notions of resistance can actually work to reinscribe center-periphery relations. Second problem is with the literary text, that literary resistance is simply somehow in the third one is the problem that is to set aside the very pervasive theory of power that Foucault puts forward in the archaeology of knowledge, the theory that power inscribes its resistances. So in the process seeks to contain them. So literary text is a structure of intentionality and social text is a communicative gesture of pure availability. So we do have figures of colonial resistance, and here I have tried to look at Homi Bhabha and Abdul Jan Muhammad. So Ginny Sharp wrote a beautiful, wonderful article, Modern Fiction Studies, and the title is Figures of Colonial Resistance. So this article invokes a reconsideration of the works of theorists like Spivak, Bhabha, Muhammad, that is Abdul Jan Muhammad, and Benita Perry, each of whom has worked to correct the critical tendency to presume the transparency of literary resistance in colonial and post-colonial writing. I'm not going to get into details. I will be going a bit fast because I have to cover other important things. So moving on to resistance, here we can look at the ego, transference, repression, resistance, ego, that is resistance working through superego resist. Okay, so an anti-cathex of this kind is clearly seen in obsessive neurosis. Again, I'm referring to the three egos of resistances, that's the repression, resistance, and so on and so forth. So you can see on the screen, I will be looking now at the types of resistances. So there are very famous resistance movement. One was the ABBA, that's a women's war first called Rights and Kenya's Resistance War, Mau Mau. So the Aba Women's War started in November 1929 when Igbo women in eastern Nigeria rose up in mass protest against the new British decree that women should be included in the census head count. They believed this meant they would soon be taxed, an action they feared because they felt the taxes already imposed on their men caused their poverty. So they also resented the imposition of indirect rule by the chiefs selected by the British, which took away their powers. So this was something related to, in detail, you can go through that. So during the Aba Women's War, around 25,000 women sang and danced and then began looting and attacking symbols of European domination, such as trading stores and Barclays Bank. They also broke into prison and released prisoners. The war lasted for approximately 2 months. So Kenya's resistance war, Mau Mau, was against the British. J.C. Kerathos, who was born in South Africa and went to medical school in England, and then he has written The Psychology of Mau Mau, describing the efforts of the key Hugo in Kenya to resist European rule. So African mind and behavior were governed wholly by the emotions of this movement. Now, moving on to the types of resistances, as I have mentioned, Michel Foucault's very idea on the power, that power inscribes its own resistances. So we do have types of resistances like religious, ethical, geographical, economic, moral, social, psychological, cultural, historical, political, and so on and so forth. Now, moving on to resistance, we do have two types of resistance, active and passive, and again, moving further, we can have active resistors and passive resistors. So resistance is defined by Bill Ashcroft in his book called Postcolonial Transformation as a word which adapts itself to a great variety of circumstances, and few other words show a greater tendency towards clinch and empty rhetoric, as it has become increasingly used a catch-all term to describe any kind of political struggle. So we do have one of the examples that Bill Ashcroft takes as an example of passive resistance. He mentions Mahatma Gandhiji was an effective example of passive resistance against British rule in India. That is what he mentions. So the most fascinating feature of post-colonial societies is the resistance that manifests itself as a refusal to absorb, which engages, which is resisted in difficult way, taking the array of influences exerted by dominating power and altering them into tools for expressing deeply held sense of identity and cultural being. So we do have resistance in the post-colonial societies. So this engagement of colonial discourse has rarely been regarded as resistance because it is often devoid of rhetoric of resistance. So here I have mentioned names of Barbara Harlow and Sylvain Courzeau. Let me also mention about one important name, Ghassan Kanifani. For him, resistance literature, because he was he used the word resistance for the first time, and the word in Arabic is called as mukawama. So he used this term and applied in a description of Palestinian literature in 1966. And he is a writer and critic. His name is Ghassan Kanifani. So for him, resistance literature invoked a distinction between an occupied people and a people in exile. So such literature was seen to be an identifiable and significant accompaniment to project of political, military, and social striving for national liberation. Now we move on to the resistance and post-colonial literature. When we look at romantic literature, obviously Great Britain, late 18th century, British Romanticism, whereas when we look at Victorian period, so Victorian literature, Age of Enlightenment, Queen Victoria's regime, and when we look at post-colonial literature, obviously it is the representative of its nation, it is a symbol of resistance against its oppressors or the colonizers. So we move on to post-colonial theory and literature. So post-colonial theory and literature can be seen as nothing but the two ideas that surfaced in post-colonial theory and literature are representation and resistance. So to a great extent, post-colonial theory and literature is nothing but it is the representation and resistance that can be looked at. Now, moving on to post-colonial literature, resistance literature uses the language of empire to rebut its dominant ideologies. Resistance theory in post-colonial literature, it refutes the very notion that the idea of representation also connotes further subjugation. So the colonized nation is writing back to the center, speaking either of the oppression and racism of the colonizers or the inherent cultural betterness of the indigenous people. So Helen Tiffin applies this point in her essay, Post-Colonial Literature and Counter Discourse, stating that the post-colonial literatures and cultures are thus constituted in counter-discursive rather than homologous practices, and they offer fields or counter-discursive strategies to the dominant discourse. So thus, the counter-discursive nature constitute post-colonial literatures. Rather than a unifying style or theme, counter-discourse fails to recognize that by existing simply to react against or to resist dominant ideology, it is marginalized into an idea that cannot stand on its own. So Helen Tiffin further states that counter-discourse exists only in its determining relation with its material situation. So the concept of either cannot exist without its relationship to its reference point. So the basic question that arises here is, what is the fate of post-colonial literature? Is this literature only a subset or a reaction to the already existing dominant discourse in English literature? So here I have mentioned post-colonial literature as a representation, as a resistance against the marginalization, and also a writing back paradigm that has been used for the empowerment of those nations. So resistance, as I mentioned, power itself inscribes its resistances. Then we move on to the second part. I would not be going much into detail, what is indigenous discourse and so on and so forth. Here also, let me move on to some of the important things that I would like to mention. Who are indigenous? Marginalized sections of society, Aborigines, Maori in New Zealand, First Nations in Canada, indigenous in US, Janajatis in India, or tribes in anthropology. So we move on to notified communities in the administrative parlance in many countries, indigenous people in discourse of human rights, and Adivasis in the terminology of Asian activists affected due to the process of colonialism, imperialism, modernity, and globalization. Now, who is Deborah Harry? I would not get into much details of her too. Let me talk about the course that is being related to biocolonialism. I would be talking about my basic arguments that I would like to develop when we talk about biocolonialism. So it's an interdisciplinary approach, how indigenous resistance discourses are formulated, again, through literary writings, through text, through discourse, verbal and non-verbal communication, and writing itself is an act of resistance. So that is very important when we talk about literatures, especially the post-colonial literatures. Here I have also taken up an example of Birsa Munda from the tribal community. Then we move on to indigenous studies that are being available. Moving on to biocolonialism. So what is the how the term came into existence, how the term is being used. So I would be looking at biocolonial resistance discourses. That is the basic concern over here in the present context, how we look at that. So the basic argument of the presentation, though I have tried to look at post-colonial literatures, something which is being in the present context that I would like to mention, and I would be failing in my duty as a keynote speaker if I don't point out to these important things. So the basic argument of the presentation is that up till now, America was excluded due to its superpower position in the world. But now I think this position of America needs to be redefined and reanalyzed due to its unpreparedness or failure during the death-threatening COVID-19 situation or the crisis. Whether it's the superpower nation like America or developing countries or developed countries, each and every nation has been a victim of biocolonialism. In this context, I'm deliberately using this particular term because I am trying to use this term to signify the countries that have been victimized during this pandemic period. And it is not for the first time that the world has witnessed this kind of deadliest pandemic. Prior to this, the world has witnessed various kinds of epidemics and pandemics. But now what we need to understand is biocolonial power that is used in the present context. And obviously it has changed the language and the literature. A modification in our approach, a kind of rupture that developed in the postmodern context. The whole era of postcolonialism, postmodernism has a paradigm shifts in its approach, as our studies have up till now focused on colonialism, postcolonialism, modernism and postmodernism, but it's now time to focus on the emergence of also something which is called as biocolonialism. And later on, when one day we all are able to overcome this deadliest pandemic, which we have already done, once again we are able to reclaim the normalcy, and then definitely we would be focusing on the post-biocolonialism and its aftermath, and has affected almost every segment of human existence, from mother's womb to the tomb. Definitions of language, literature, culture, religion, and so on and so forth, they have underwent great modification in the contemporary times. So in our communication, in our day-to-day discourse, even in the literary circles, from actual pandemic disease to social media, WhatsApp, and so on and so forth, we have discourse items that are being used, such words as quarantine, isolation. Previously, the meaning of isolation, it depended in the context in which it was being used, but now it is used as a discourse item. Home quarantine, plasma therapy, donating plasma, COVID-19, coronavirus, 14 days quarantine, ventilator, oxygen mask, and now even we do have sanitizers, sanitized arsenic, webinars, Zoom. What we are doing right now is a example of a webinar, international webinar on 3-day post-colonial studies, mute, unmute, and so on and so forth, password, ID registrations, and so on and so forth. So this is an example of language. Moving on to literature, lot of literature has emerged during this particular period. Example, we can take up even the post-pandemic COVID-19 poems that are being published in volumes by Cape Camorin Trust. They can be taken as example. Lawrence Wright text, it is called as the end of October 2020, or the plague year America in the time of COVID, which is published in the year 2021. American writer is a Pulitzer Prize winner writer who has written a text based on COVID-19. So these are, and there are many more examples that can be taken up and cited over here as the literature that has been produced during this particular period. So now the basic, again coming on to the other part, is the definitions of haves and haves not have been changed. Complete rupture from postmodernism. Everything that was termed to be post, the center-periphery relations have changed. The powerful and the powerless, the center and margin, once again, they need to be redefined. So the one who has power has the knowledge, and the one who has both is at the center. But as I mentioned, in the present context, there was a great failure. There were those who considered themselves to be superpower, they failed drastically in the present times. Almost all the countries of the world failed to handle the situation. The kind of destruction that caused after the world wars, countries were able to emerge from that. But most probably the situation is different in the present context. So what is needed? Do we need to reformulate the discourses that are already formulated? So we do need to look at this And once again, the world is nothing but an object. So the position of the world itself has changed due to this global pandemic. So the world is nothing, as I mentioned, but an object. Human beings, or so to say, the man has lost its central position in the global context. Everywhere there is a failure. Everywhere we could see the failure which has led to a Great Depression period in the history of humankind, and I am using deliberately humankind and not mankind. So the biocolonial weapon that has been used has created or gave birth to various global discourses that need to be redefined in the global context. So how we redefine biocolonialism, I am mentioning over here biocolonial. To a great extent, I have tried to look at that, and I have made an honest attempt to redefine biocolonialism in the present times. I started with colonialism, post-colonial, differences between imperialism and colonialism, and so on and so forth. I could try to cover up from the very definition of colony to the present times what exactly I meant by biocolonialism in the present times, how bio weapons are being used to destruct the humanity. So giving me this opportunity, I thank you all for giving a patient listening. Thank you, Regan Silvest and the organizers, for giving me this opportunity to be here on this international platform. Thank you so much.
Ma'am, you have excellent ideas of post-colonialism through multiple angles. We are proud of you. Thank you, ma'am. If you permit, ma'am, we would like to have you to answer our question. Let me leave the podium to Dr. Amal J. Eronimus.
So exceptionally, you presented the post-colonial thought and literature, ma'am. We're really excited to have you, and I hope the viewers have enjoyed your presentation, the way you displayed, more with the stuff than with the skeleton. So excited by everybody. So we have got a few questions and raised by the students community of Panevalangani College and other colleges. Shall I, ma'am?
Yeah, ma'am.
Yep.
Yes, yes.
So the first question is like, do all theories on post-colonialism favor monopoly of the modern world? That question is also in the mailbox, ma'am, and message box. You can also view the question. Do all theories on post-colonialism favor the monopoly of the modern world? That's the first question raised. We have about 4 questions. Maybe if you are willing to answer them one by one, we are so happy to.
Okay. Do all theories on post-colonialism favor the monopoly of modern world? Is it true that the volumes occurring in the third world is behind the scheme supported by the capitalist countries have proper literature rights against it? Or do we look at the post-colonial challenges in South Asian region? Is restricted by post-colonial writers to export or defend folk literature? Okay. There are 3 to 4 questions that have been put forth. Do all theories on post-colonialism favor monopoly of the modern world? Now, when we look at different theories, as I told you, I have mentioned that post-colonial theories itself is an offshoot of postmodernism. So obviously, I don't think, because depending upon the kind of theory, we are looking at different theories that have developed in the post-colonial period. Maybe theory of resistance. So we cannot say that the theory of resistance favor the monopoly of modern world, because the theory itself, I mean to say post-colonial literature, as I'm looking at it, it represents resistance. So it is a resistance to the monopoly of the modern world. So one can look at it as a resistance when we talk about the post-colonial theories or post-colonial literatures as such. So not all theories we can say that they favor the monopoly of the modern world, because post-colonial literature in the presentation itself, I have tried to define that how post-colonial literatures and post-colonial theory itself is nothing but it is the theory of resistance and representation. So in that context, I think that it doesn't go with the monopoly, or it doesn't favor the monopoly of the modern world. Second question is it true that the violence occurring in the third world is behind the screen supported by capitalist countries, and how far this literature writes against it? So in the presentation, I also mentioned about the way in which the world is being divided when we categorize the first world, the second, the third world, so on and so forth. But now, in the last part of my presentation, as I mentioned about the biocolonial weapon, and in the post-pandemic period, how there has been drastically each and every country in the world at the global level, they failed to understand, or they failed to handle the situation. And we have also seen the unpreparedness of the countries in the global context. So whether it is supported by the capitalist countries or whether it is not, but in the present times, when we talk about the global period, we can see that how there has been a drastic failure. Now we know when we talk about the haves and haves not, we talk about the way in which we have the superiors and the inferiors. So in that context, we need to understand this particular thing. And there are countries that each and every country writes, and as I told you, writing itself is an act of resistance. So if not openly, they are trying to resist through their writings, and obviously third world country also does that. Now even in my one of my presentations, I have been talk about the third world, like how and in what way are we
நம்ம
going
screen
to
வரல.
categorize the world. Now moving on to, and definitely their writing itself is an act of resistance, and these countries, the third world literature or the third world countries do write, and it's nothing but it is an act of resistance and representation. So the next question is, how do you look at the post-colonial challenges in the South Asian region? Not only in South Asian region, almost every country in the world, as I'm talking in the present context. That's why we need to rethink and reformulate, and we need to have reconsiderations about the way in which we are looking at the post-colonial challenges, because it's not only in the post-colonial context, but it is in the present pandemic period, COVID-19, how we look at it. It is in the biocolonial period now, because it's not post-colonial that we need to look at, but in the present times. And that's why I mentioned about the rupture that has been created from postmodernism into this biocolonialism. So we have to rethink in the present context that how do we face these challenges that are being put forth. So I think it is not only with the South Asian region, but almost every country in the world needs to face these challenges of the present times. Now, the next question is, what is the step taken by post-colonial writers to expose or defend folk literature? So, as I mentioned, that we don't have much of folk literature in published form, but we do have folk literature in oral form. So there should be, and there are steps that are being taken to publish or to make an awareness of the folk literature. So I think I have simplified the the participants who have raised their questions, and I have tried my level to answer these questions. Thank you so much for posing these questions, and really it was, I am really pleased to be part of this 3-day international conference. Thank you. Thank you once again.
Thank you very much, ma'am. There is one more question raised by Mr. Anil Kumar Mandal. Would you like to answer him?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Mr. Anil, you can pose your question. Hello? Mr. Anil, are you there? Ma'am, he doesn't answer. So you're really enchanted. Yeah. You're really enchanted the gathering, and we are really proud of you. And your presentation was exceptionally so great in such way for the scholars and students to take down notes and learn from different angles of postcolonialism, and especially the bioweapon. When you said it was really up to date the way you have prepared your stuff, and so proud of you, ma'am. I really thank you very much. Move to the